Colonial powers employed a number of strategies to maintain control of their far-flung empires. Today I want to briefly consider three of these strategies, focusing in particular on the third strategy, that of divide and rule, and its impact on post-colonial politics in the global South. Before proceeding, though, it's important to remember that all colonial powers used these three systems in varying ways in different colonies. The Spanish, for example, often relied on settlement in their New World colonies, while the British used settlement, indirect rule, and divide and rule in various combinations and formations depending upon the specific colony. Let's look at each in greater detail. The first was settlement. Under this strategy, large numbers of settlers from the colonial power itself migrated and established permanent residency in the colony. This strategy was employed primarily by the British in colonies like the United States, Canada, Australia, and to a lesser extent in Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, and was often accompanied by the gradual transfer of political authority to the settler government in the colony. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, settlement was accompanied by the wholesale destruction of the indigenous population. However, in the British colonies, as well as in French Algeria, German Namibia, and Portuguese in Mozambique, settlement generally resulted in the dislocation of communities and the relegation of Africans to more marginal lands. At the end of World War II, there was an estimated 10 million so-called white Africans, individuals of European descent with permanent residency in Africa. Perhaps not surprisingly then, settlement also generated considerable post-colonial racial tensions, particularly around the control and ownership of land. Take, for example, the southern African country of Zimbabwe. When British colonists arrived in Zimbabwe, which they named Southern Rhodesia, they awarded themselves each exclusive ownership of 3,000 acres of land. All black Africans living on that land were declared to be tenant farmers, lacking any ownership right or title. By the time Zimbabwe achieved independence in 1980, there were an estimated 300,000 white settlers, representing less than 10% of the country's total population. Yet white Zimbabweans at that time had an average income of around $8,000 per person, making them one of the richest populations in the world at the time. By way of comparison, average income in the United States at the time was about $9,000. Whites in Zimbabwe controlled about 40% of the country's farmland, including the vast majority of its most productive agricultural land. And these farms accounted for about 40% of all economic activity in the country, and about 60% of the country's foreign exchange earnings. Meanwhile, blacks were confined to the least productive areas of the country. Indeed, much of the animosity surrounding President Robert Mugabe's land reform efforts and the violence that has accompanied them are rooted in the perceived racial inequalities derived from white settlement. The second strategy of control centered on patterns of indirect rule discussed in the previous module. Here, local elites were co-opted through promises of assimilation or bribery. This practice, as witnessed in India, the British West Indies, and across Africa, generated tensions between indigenous communities and their leaders, often undermining the political efficacy of post-colonial states. The third strategy of control was the practice of divide and rule. This strategy was often accompanied by the other two, and involved a direct, conscious effort on the part of the colonial power to pit one group against the other. Divisions could be ethnic, linguistic, cultural, religious, really anything that could be used to divide society socially. After fermenting local tensions, the colonial power could position itself as the keeper of the peace, providing a moral fig leaf for its colonial interventions. Thus, in India, Britain pitted Hindus against Muslims, while in Nigeria, it frequently reclassified regions in order to exacerbate tensions between ethnic Igbo and Hausa. But in perhaps the most famous example of divide and rule, German and Belgian colonial authorities divided ethnicities in Rwanda. Most of us are already familiar with the events surrounding the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 people, mostly Tutsis, were killed by the Hutu-dominated government of Rwanda. At the time, the Rwandan genocide was explained by the media and political leaders in the United States as a case of long-standing ethnic hatred, conforming easily to the dominant understandings of Africa we explored in the previous module. But such an understanding is fundamentally wrong. The 1994 genocide had nothing to do with differences in language or religion. Indeed, prior to the colonization of Rwanda by Germany after the Berlin Conference in 1884, the Hutu-Tutsi distinction was not particularly pronounced. Hutus and Tutsis shared a common language, common religious and philosophical beliefs, a common culture marked by song, dance, and poetry, and a common folklore and traditional heroes. By most markers of national or ethnic identity, they were effectively one people. The distinction between the two groups was more like class or caste than ethnicity or nation. Hutus were generally poorer and were farmers. Tutsis, on the other hand, were generally wealthier and earned their living as cattle ranchers. Movement between the two groups, based on intermarriage, wealth, or status, was common. A relatively wealthy Tutsi who lost his cattle could become Tutsi. A Hutu woman who married a Tutsi would become Tutsi. And importantly, both groups exercised political power. However, German colonists arriving in the late 19th century deemed Tutsis superior and made them the dominant group in Rwandan society, employing them in positions of authority to enforce colonial rule. When Germany lost World War I, it was forced to cede its colonies to other European powers, and Belgium claimed control of Rwanda. It continued Germany's practice of divide and rule based on the Hutu-Tutsi distinction. The Tutsi elite were responsible for the collection of taxes and the administration of justice in Rwanda. As a result, Hutu animosity towards colonialism was redirected away from the Germans and Belgians and towards the Tutsi. Similarly, because they were a minority population in Rwanda, the Tutsis were dependent on the support of the colonial power to maintain their position. In 1933, Belgium introduced identity cards to Rwanda. These cards, akin to internal passports for Rwandans, included ethnicity, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, of the bearer. It's difficult to underestimate the impact of the passports on Rwandan society. By encoding ethnic identity into an official and perhaps more importantly, unchanging document, Belgian colonial officials entrenched divisions between Hutu and Tutsi in ways that had not historically been the case. The flexibility and social mobility that had historically been available evaporated, and Rwandans became Hutu or Tutsi permanently. When Rwanda achieved independence from Belgium in 1962, it was a deeply underdeveloped country. There was not a single Rwandan in the country with a college degree. Approximately 90% of the population earned their living as subsistence farmers. The country's economy was structured around coffee exports and as a result was highly vulnerable to price fluctuations. There were no railroads, and only a handful of roads connected producers with global markets. And because of Belgium's colonial policy of divide and rule, the vast majority of positions in the government were occupied by Tutsi, generating considerable resentment among the majority Hutu population. The 1994 Rwandan genocide itself was sparked when President Habyarimana's plane was shot down on April 4, 1994. Habyarimana was returning from negotiations in Tanzania intended to quell growing tensions between Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. The Rwandan military and paramilitary forces, known as the Interahamwe, quickly seized control of the government, accusing the Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front of shooting down the plane. The RPF, for its part, countered that the downing of the plane was more likely the result of a coup within Habyarimana's own government. Within 100 days, more than 800,000 people would be dead. But underlying the genocide was the economic collapse of Rwanda. In the late 1980s, The collapse of the International Coffee Agreement sent global coffee prices into freefall. As a result, Rwanda's export earnings earned up. Poverty increased sharply, and a food crisis emerged, as Rwanda could no longer afford to pay for the imported food using its now non-existent coffee exports. At the same time, the government increased its military response, expanding the size of its armed forces and arresting thousands of political opponents. It also began a national campaign against Tutsis, blaming them for the problems faced by the country. Government-run radio stations campaigned promoting Hutu power in song, and the Ten Commandments of the Bahutu sought to distance Hutus and Tutsis from one another. During the genocide, the very system of IDs that were introduced by the Belgians in 1933 were used to identify Tutsis for extermination. The killing machine was both primitive and efficient. An average of 8,000 people per day. That's 133 per minute, every minute, for 100 days, were killed, often by their neighbors using machetes. But despite framings of the primordial ethnic hatred, the animosity that generated during the genocide were rooted in the economy, the collapse of coffee prices, and the economic turmoil that ensued, and the divide and rule policy of the Belgian colonial government.